Thank you very much. A couple of personal notes. My first teaching job was not very far from here at Wellesley College, and my wife was also a teacher. She taught at Newton South High School in Dana Hall and was a member of the Massachusetts Teachers Association. And in the summer of 1966, we got one of those nice charter flights, cheap charter flights, and the dollar was still strong, and we didn't have any kids yet, and spent a delightful summer in Europe, so I remember that very well. It's a particular pleasure for me to be here in the Senate chamber, at least the replica of the Senate chamber. Like other kids, I had a favorite sport, and like other kids, I had those fantasies about playing a big role in that sport. Now, unlike other kids, my favorite sport was politics. And instead of dreaming about being a quarterback or a pitcher or a center or a forward, I dreamt about being a senator. So in a way, I finally got here. And even more to the point of what my subject today, I am standing, well, actually I should be right down there, standing where President Wilson stood 3 times. We all know that he revived the custom, the practice, discontinued by Jefferson, of the president speaking before Congress. Now, usually he spoke before joint sessions of Congress in the House chamber, and he did it more than any other president before or since. One of the reasons for that, of course, is he didn't have the electronic media yet, and TV appearances have I think, taken the place of what Wilson was trying to achieve then. But 3 times he spoke to the Senate, just to the Senate. Once was when he gave his Peace Without Victory address, which was indeed the kind of liberal international vision, American international vision that David referred to. The second time was to plead for the senators to pass the woman suffrage amendment. That was in September 1918. And the third time was in 1919 when he presented the Treaty of Versailles to the Senate. So he did that 3 times. You can say, in a way, he didn't win on any of those occasions. That's too bad, but that is something to remember. I'm going to disappoint you a little bit. David has promised you that I will talk about the peacemaking and the League fight. I'd be delighted to do that in the question and answer, but I want to do something a little different. David has given you a wonderful picture, a large picture of major movements and ideas that were at work. I want to sharpen or narrow the focus. I want to talk about one event, which is American intervention in World War I, because 2 days from now, we will mark the centennial of that. And as a matter of fact, right now at this very hour is the centennial of when the United States Senate took up the war resolution. And in a minute or two, I'm going to quote from one of the speeches in that. And the question is, why? Why did we go into World War I? And I'm going to concentrate on one person. That is Woodrow Wilson. Now, the reason for that concentration is I can give you a very simple, straightforward answer as to why we got into World War I. The simple, straightforward answer is the United States entered World War I because Woodrow Wilson decided to take the country in. Does that sound simplistic? Well, it shouldn't be. Now, of course, he was the one who went to Congress and asked for the declaration of war. But I mean something more substantial. I'll put it this way. Every indicator of public and congressional opinion at the beginning of April 1917 shows that large majorities, both in the public at large and in both houses on Capitol Hill, still stood exactly where they had stood, or more or less exactly where they had stood for nearly 2 years since the sinking of the Lusitania on May 7th, 1915. Back then, at the time of the Lusitania sinking, Wilson had correctly noted that Americans had what he called a double wish. They wanted satisfaction from Germany about the submarine attacks, but they didn't want to get involved in the war. Wilson, of course, was our most highly educated president, had more formal education than any other. But he could also be surprisingly superstitious. Early in the war, he'd confided to his advisor, Colonel House, that he and James Madison were the only 2 graduates of Princeton to become president. and he was afraid of Madison's fate of 1812. He believed, as most historians then and later have believed, that Madison was forced into an unnecessary war by outraged public and congressional opinion. Wilson did not share that fate. As I said, every indicator of public and especially congressional opinion shows that he could have carried majorities in either both houses of Congress for whatever he chose. He carried them for war, as he did, but he could have carried them for continued neutrality. Winston Churchill observed a long time ago, "It seems no exaggeration to pronounce that the actions of the United States, with its repercussions on the history of the world, depended during the awful period of Armageddon." I'm trying to resist imitating Churchill. It's very difficult for me to resist it. "Depended during the awful period of Armageddon on the workings of this man's mind and spirit to the exclusion of almost every other factor, and that he played a part in the fate of the nations, incomparably more direct and personal than any other man." Spot on. Wilson held the fate of this nation in his hands, and he was the one who made the decision to intervene. Now, let's get a little more complicated about this. Well, why did he decide the way he did? I find it easier to address that, at least to start, by saying what did not influence him. I can put it very simply. It was neither God nor mammon. The two schools of negative views of Wilson have stressed one or the other of those. Either his supposedly grandiose idealism, which supposedly stemmed from religious zealotry, or the influence of big money, which had heavily invested in loans to the Allies. A little over 10 years ago in Washington, I was talking at a symposium, and I made the statement that Woodrow Wilson did not take the country into war because he thought he heard God telling him to do it. I quickly added, remember this is 2006 in Washington, I quickly added that I did not mean that as a criticism of the way a certain Republican president had taken us into war. And I added that I didn't mean it as a criticism of the way President McKinley had taken us into war in 1898, unlike William James. Wilson was too good an Orthodox Christian to entertain notions of having a direct pipeline to God. At the time of the sinking of the Lusitania, he'd responded to somebody who told him, "In the name of God, declare war." War is not declared in the name of God. It is a human affair altogether. Well, got a little more complicated when he actually did go in, and I'll come back to that. Well, if it wasn't God, what about mammon? During the 1930s, sentiment turned very heavily, massively against our having gone to war in 1917. Even more massively, and I think this will surprise most of us in this room, than it would later turn against having gone to war in Vietnam. Wilson's reputation really sank into the gutter. The charges went that he'd been a covert sympathizer with the Allies, particularly the British. He'd been rescuing the big investments that Wall Street had made by lending to the Allies. And I'll give you a flavor of that because it comes from one of those Senate speeches. It's interesting, by the way, that the speeches in Congress on the war resolutions in both houses, the memorable speeches came from the opponents. And the strongest congressional speech against it, I think, came, interestingly enough, not from the renowned orator of my former state, Wisconsin, La Follette, who gave a long, detailed, interesting speech against it, but from George Norris of Nebraska, who was quite a man too, but not noted for being a flamboyant orator. He talks about the moguls of Wall Street. Their object in having war and in preparing for war is to make money. Human suffering and the sacrifice of human life are necessary, but Wall Street considers only the dollars and cents. The moguls will be concealed in their palatial offices on Wall Street, sitting behind mahogany desks covered with clipped coupons soiled with the sweat of honest toil, coupons stained with mothers' tears, coupons dyed in the lifeblood of their fellow men. We are going into the war upon the command of gold. We are going to risk sacrificing millions of our countrymen's lives in order that other countrymen may coin their lifeblood into money. Pretty powerful. I think there are really two parts to the indictment of Wilson, something more than money. There are also ethnic and cultural factors, or aspersions here. Well, let me kill the first bird with one stone of that. Wilson was unquestionably an Anglophile. His mother and all four of his grandparents had been born under the Union Jack. Like most educated Americans of that time, he esteemed English literature and English culture above all others, well, Scottish too in his case. But it was one thing to harbor those kinds of sentiments and something else to put them into play as policy. I think the one time it may have swayed him was at the beginning of the war, when he made a soft response to the opening of the British blockade. Now, that soft response seemed pretty non-controversial at the time, because it involved only us and the British. The Germans hadn't yet entered the picture because they had not yet started their submarine warfare. Not making a strong challenge to the blockade seemed to everybody then involved as just a way to avoid some unnecessary trouble. And by the way, that includes the Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, whom nobody has ever accused or could accuse of sympathizing with either side in the war. Later, as the British steadily tightened this blockade, and of course they had some nice cover because we were preoccupied later with the submarine issue, Wilson became far less sympathetic toward the Allies. And another factor, which is worth mentioning here especially, in later souring him and the American public on the British, was Ireland. The brutal suppression of the Easter Rising in April 1916 appeared to many Americans as an equivalent to what the Germans had done with their brutal invasion of Belgium. By late 1816, both the President and the majority of Americans had come to have a kind of plague of both your houses attitude toward the two warring camps. Well, if it wasn't culture and ethnicity, what about mammon? The outbreak of World War I had come as a boon to the American economy. At the beginning of that year, the economy had gone into a severe recession, which very likely would have deepened into a depression, except for the war orders. By the end of that year, war orders and loans to pay for them had provided a big economic stimulus. And they went, of course, all to one side, to the Allies. Now, the barons of Wall Street may also have been Anglophiles, but they were going where the money was. Britannia ruled the waves, and German shipping, both civilian and naval, had been swept away. The U.S. became the biggest supplier of foodstuffs and machine goods, and in some cases, not all, weaponry to the Allies. And the massiveness of this trade soon turned us into not just a creditor nation, which, as David pointed out, we had all just become, but the world's leading creditor nation. In the 1930s, economics ruled everybody's thinking, and there had been revelations of pro-Allied sentiment in the Wilson circle. So it was easy to blame the influence of money for going to war. A few people at that time, though, bothered to ask whether this was really so. And especially they didn't bother to ask what were Wilson's relations with Wall Street. If they'd had, they would have found that those relations were sour to the point of toxicity. This was the height of the Progressive era, and Wilson and his Democrats had enacted sweeping reforms that included the Federal Reserve, antitrust laws, income and inheritance taxes, aid to farmers, a prohibition on child labor, an 8-hour law for railroad workers, and the Supreme Court seat for that arch foe of big business, Louis Brandeis. Rather impressive, isn't it? In the hard-fought election of 1916, the Republicans had retreated from reform and sought to make America great again by turning the clock back to the time of McKinley. They didn't win in 1916, but they got what they wanted in 1920. Now, despite all the attention that historians have paid to the 1916 election, particularly to that slogan, "He kept us out of war," this election, like most, turned much more so on domestic issues. In many ways, it was a kind of rerun of 1896. Only this time, Wilson, unlike Bryan, was able to crack the Republican solid Midwest by carrying Ohio, and then eked out a whisker's breadth victory in California to become the first Democrat since Andrew Jackson to win a second consecutive term. Wilson owed nothing to Wall Street or to big business generally, just the reverse. Like most progressives, he was deeply suspicious of them, and he shared the belief of those anti-war progressives like Senator Norris that big business and conservatives were fomenting war to make money and to undo reform. In addition, the economy had recovered nicely, and businessmen were complaining that the war orders were actually becoming a drag on what they wanted to sell to the home market. Okay, I think that's a way of saying what didn't influence Wilson in his deciding to go to war. Well, what did? Okay, here I have to get into other things, which I'll get into a larger context too. He entered the Wilson, and I think David painted a nice picture of the way not only most average Americans, but even leading Americans were toward foreign policy. They just didn't think about it very much. He was a neophyte. And he said, right after the election of 1912, to a Princeton colleague, he said, "It would be an irony of fate if my administration had to deal chiefly with foreign problems, for all my preparation has been in domestic matters." He had to learn diplomacy on the job, and boy, did he fumble. David, I think you once called him ham-handed in the way he dealt with Mexico, and yes, I think that's a good characterization. Well, that was his, quote, learning experience. By the time of the war's outbreak in August 1914, he had become a defter diplomatist. Although, I think it's also well to note he was in a terrible emotional state because his first wife died just as the war broke out. So I think it's well to remember that his initial responses to the war came when he was under that emotional cloud. But those responses were not front-burner matters for him because, again, the war seemed a terrible tragedy that was happening to other people far away across the Atlantic. And as David pointed out too, for a lot of Americans, this again was a spectacular confirmation of our exceptionalism. You know, how different and how lucky we were not to be part of militaristic, monarch-ridden Europe, which our ancestors had had the wisdom to get out of. The great turning point, the second greatest turning point for Americans with World War I, second only to intervention itself, came with the sinking of the Lusitania. 15 years ago, people were making comparisons between the 9/11 disaster and earlier events, especially Pearl Harbor. I think the Lusitania offers a better parallel. It came out of the blue, not part of a big diplomatic clash. It involved the latest mode of transportation and one of the biggest human-made structures. The sinking of the Titanic 3 years earlier offered the best comparison for people at the time, and many commentators said here was a human act, not an act of God, or man's act equaled God's act. 10 years after the sinking of the Lusitania, a journalist found that everybody he interviewed could remember where they'd been, what they'd thought when they heard the sinking of the Lusitania, what they'd done for the rest of the day. Is there anybody here who doesn't remember 9/11 that way? I also remember my parents talking about Pearl Harbor that way. 2 years ago, Eric Larson published a best-selling book, Dead Wake, about the Lusitania. I bet you some of you have read it. I found it a good read, especially with the details about people on the ship. But it ends on a false note. After briefly describing our eventual entry into the war, almost 2 years, remember, after the sinking of the Lusitania, Larson's last words are, "Remember the Lusitania." Well, that's a false note, because at the time, people remembered the Lusitania is 17 years after the sinking of the Maine, and people were amazed that there was no such similar cry, "Remember the Maine." No, remember the Lusitania. In fact, the public reaction was just the opposite. The New York newspapers uncharacteristically pooled their resources and canvassed editorial opinion around the country. Out of 1,000 responses that they got, anybody know or want to take a guess as to how many said we ought to go to war? We have a guess here, please? I'll do a little poll. High or low? How many? 19. Do I have any more? More bids? High or low? What? 5. Close. 6. 6 out of 1,000. It's not hard to see why. The American press had been amply, I'd say sometimes obsessively, covering the war in Europe, particularly the Western Front. Unlike in 1898, there were no summer holiday illusions about a splendid little war. One politician later said that Americans had been picturing their sons and husbands and brothers in that carnage. No wonder then that they had what Wilson called that double wish. Well, what was he to do? Well, what he did was to engage in a long-running, slow-motion fencing match with the Germans about the use of the submarine. They claimed that its value was strictly a matter of surprise, that they could sink without warning. He claimed that they must abide by the established rules of cruiser warfare and make provision for people on the ships. Now, even for somebody like me who has spent a long time studying this, there's still things about this that seem strange to me. The number of Americans involved was not large. And since our merchant marine had really withered away since the Civil War, only a handful of American ships were sunk. Many anti-interventionists saw these stakes as too small to risk the peace of 100 million people. That's the argument Bryan made, first within the cabinet and then publicly after he resigned as Secretary of State. Well, on the opposite side was not just national pride. Remember, over 100 Americans died in the sinking of the Lusitania. This injected an emotional dimension into relations with Germany that didn't figure into relations with the Allies. Their blockade might hurt Americans in their pocketbooks, but it did not cost them their lives. Now, although the public and Congress had little appetite to get into this war, there were vocal critics led by, yes, indeed, Theodore Roosevelt, who insistently hammered it away that we must stand up for the nation's honor and resist the barbarity of an evil empire. By the way, the terms hawk and dove wouldn't come into use for another 50 years, but boy, do TR and Bryan ever perfectly epitomize the hawk and the dove. Still, why? Why did this eventually come to intervention? Well, for one thing, I think we need to understand what the Germans did and what they thought they were doing. The war turned into a stalemate on the Western Front, and both sides were looking for ways to get around that stalemate. The British went in for Gallipoli, they went in for trying to stir up the Arabs, hence T.E. Lawrence. The Germans colluded with the Irish revolutionaries before the Easter Rising, and they sent Lenin back to Russia after the Tsar's overthrow. Both sides also used their navies. The ever-tightening British blockade was aimed to starve Germany, economically and to some extent literally. The Germans were kept from deploying their big surface fleet by geography. And only once did they sail out and try to challenge the British. That was at Jutland in 1916. It was a draw, and the Germans stayed pinned down. Okay, here comes the submarine. I think with the submarine, we have an example of fascination and fantasy with new military technology. The champions of the submarine proclaimed it as a magic new weapon that would inflict great harm on the enemy at little cost to themselves. Air power, I think, would have the same kind of allure in World War II. There were some drawbacks. The submarines of that era were slow-moving craft with short cruising ranges. You'll notice where the sinkings took place in World War I. They're all off the British and European coasts, not off our coasts as in World War II. These submarines couldn't carry a lot of torpedoes, 9 or 10 at a maximum, and there weren't very many of them. When the Germans proclaimed submarine warfare in early 1915, they had 30 submarines, 30, and only a third of those could be deployed at any one time. And yet they proclaimed that this was going to cut those vital Allied overseas supply lines. Yeah, that's like sending 10 snipers out with rifles to try to stop trucking on a major interstate highway. Even worse, this meager new weapon could do the only thing that would cause meaningful hostilities between the United States and Germany, the only thing that could cause war. German submarine advocates scoffed at the danger. After all, Roosevelt and other Americans were saying the United States had a pitifully small army and would have to cross an ocean. There were German skeptics who argued that the submarine was a distraction from the top priority, which was victory on the ground in France. Those skeptics prevailed temporarily in the spring of 1916 after Wilson took an increasingly tough line and threatened steps toward war. Those skeptics were worried less about America as an enemy and more about taking their eyes off the Western Front. That's where they expected to win in the summer of 1916. That, of course, brought the siege of Verdun, and that coupled with Britain's suicidal offensives on the Somme made 1916 the bloodiest year of the war. Wilson knew that the Germans' curtailment of the submarines might be only a respite. And as soon as he knew that he'd been reelected, he mounted a peace offensive. He did a public diplomatic note to all the belligerents asking them to state their terms. He promised to take steps toward a League of Nations to prevent future wars. Then on January 22nd, 1917, he made one of those speeches in the Senate chamber with his Peace Without Victory address. Well, he was making bold, grand moves. Too late. The Germans had already decided early in January 1917 to resume full-scale submarine warfare as of February 1st. They did it in full expectation that they'd draw the United States into the war. But they were confident they could win before we could make any difference. Now, unlike the original plunge into submarine warfare, which I think had been a foolish gamble on a weak, untried new weapon, this seemed to be a better calculated military decision. German shipyards had been turning out submarines at a brisk clip, and the advocates now that said we do have enough forces to cut that Allied overseas lifeline. There's some German historians who say they were cooking the books. Well, still, as sensible as this decision might have seemed, it was a true act of folly, and I think it sealed Germany's defeat. This is where mammon comes into the picture. For a country that had built the world's second largest economy and was the byword for technological efficiency, German leaders were astonishingly blind to the economic dimensions of war. They paid no heed to the massive debts that the Allies were racking up in America, and they knew little and cared less about the exhaustion of British credit in the United States. That was about to accomplish what the Germans were seeking to do with the submarine. That is, to have a massive curtailment of the flow of supplies to the Allies. And it would have happened with no danger of bringing the United States into the war against them. I love that modern cliche here. The Germans were snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. As far as some Americans were concerned, especially Theodore Roosevelt, we should have gone to war the minute the Germans unleashed their submarines. But Wilson didn't. He agonized for 2 months. He stubbornly resisted pressures from his allies, and he bared his soul to several confidants. To a sympathetic journalist, he said that he thought America's entering the war would mean there will be a dictated peace, a victorious peace. There won't be any peace standards left to work with. There will be only war standards. And at home, the impact would be even worse. Once lead this people into war, they'll forget there ever was such a thing as tolerance. To fight, you must be brutal and ruthless. And the spirit of ruthless brutality will enter into the very fiber of our national life, infecting Congress, the courts, the policeman on the beat, the man in the street. If there is any alternative, for God's sake, let's take it. That's pretty powerful too, isn't it? As we know, tragically, Wilson was predicting just the things that did come to pass, which he allowed to happen. Why is a great puzzlement. But to return to the question of why did he choose war, I think it's well to remember these words of his. I think, in fact, the most eloquent argument against going into the war, even more than Senator Norris's, was this one. And it came from the lips of the man who took us in. Why? I think the best way to answer it is the simplest way. Look at what he said. Look at his war address. It is not a resounding call to arms. Much of it consists of a fairly dry recital of Germany's wrongs against us and a cool calculation of how to address them. Wilson displays a quality of mind that he doesn't get much credit for, strategic realism. And he concludes that armed neutrality has the disadvantages of war without the advantage of winning and thereby having a hand in shaping the peace. Along that line, he insists that he wants the same kind of peace he sketched out 2 months earlier, or not quite 2 months earlier, in Peace Without Victory. But he admitted America was going to have to seek to do this through war, a very delicate, daunting task. But, he argued, it can't be shirked. Overall, the speech has a tone, the tone of the speech is somber. It's filled with regret and unsought choice. Like it really has a tone worthy of Abraham Lincoln. Sure, it's an idealistic speech. In fact, that was the coin of the realm. That was the rhetorical coin of the realm in those days. Everybody was an idealist, just about. Everybody talked idealistic language. Wilson does invoke America's sacred values of democracy, but he did it in a very restrained way. The most frequently cited sentence from that speech reads, "The world must be made safe for democracy." Wilson was one of the most punctilious stylists ever to sit in the Oval Office, and he would not have used the passive voice unless he meant it. There is literally a world of difference between the way he said it and the way most people have misquoted and misconstrued it. We must make the world safe for democracy. He made that meaning clear a year later when he told a group of visiting journalists, "There isn't any one kind of government which we have the right to impose upon any nation, so that I am not fighting for democracy except for the peoples that want democracy." I wish that disclaimer hadn't been off the record, because it would be another 60-plus years before that was published. And if it had been, I think a lot of ink about Wilson the idealist, Wilson the utopian might never have been spilled. But it's wrong to read his address as a piece of realistic calculation wrapped in idealistic rhetoric. If you'll forgive me, I'm getting very close to the end, but I want to read you just a little bit, the closing of that speech, the last paragraph. "It is a distressing and oppressive duty, gentlemen of the Congress." Footnote, mistake. It was not only gentlemen of the Congress. There was the first woman there, and the only vote against going into World War II. She voted against going into World War I and into World War II, Jeanette Rankin of Montana. "It is a distressing and oppressive duty, gentlemen of the Congress, which I have performed in thus addressing you. There are, it may be, many months of fiery trial and sacrifice ahead of us. It is a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful people into war, into the most terrible and disastrous of all wars, civilization itself seeming to be in the balance. But the right is more precious than the peace. And we shall fight for the things which we have always carried nearest our hearts, for democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments, for the rights and liberties of small nations, for a universal dominion of right by such a concert of free peoples as shall bring peace and safety to all nations and make the world itself at last free. To such a task we can dedicate our lives and our fortunes, everything that we are and everything that we have, with the pride of those who know that the day has come when America is privileged to spend her blood and her might for the principles that gave her birth and happiness and the peace which she has always treasured. God helping her, she can do no other." If much of the speech was worthy of Lincoln, that last line was worthy of Reinhold Niebuhr. As people then recognized, it changed only 2 words from Martin Luther's declaration to the Diet of Worms: "God helping me, I can do no other." Here I think Wilson was drawing not only on his religious faith, but also on his religious intellect. He saw the World War as the greatest collective sin in human history, and he knew that he was asking his fellow Americans to join in that sin. But as an educated Protestant who understood Luther, he knew that people, both as individuals and as nations, could not avoid sin. Instead, in seeking to know God's purposes and follow God's will, they must act humbly and uncertainly, and they could not avoid sin. Instead, they must follow Luther's dictum: sin boldly. That's why I think Woodrow Wilson took us into World War I. He did it with full knowledge that he was committing a sin, and with no assurance that it was the right thing to do. Many here and abroad are still arguing over the wisdom of our intervention in this war. I'll just stop and conclude by recalling Churchill's observation again, that the workings of this man's mind and spirit changed the history of the world and shaped the fate of the nations. And if you doubt that, just look at two places where Americans are fighting right now, Syria and Iraq. Both are creations of this war. Thank you.